Well, hey, welcome to Harvest Online. Thanks so much for checking us out whenever and wherever you're watching from. Thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Harvest Church exists so that all people may know Jesus and grow with him. We are in the middle of an I Am series where we're looking at the 7 I Am statements of Jesus through the book of John. And today we're going to talk about I am the Good Shepherd. Now, all of us have probably had somebody in our life that has loved us well and therefore they've led us well. When I was in Colorado, I took up a hobby of hiking 14,000 foot mountains. They call them 14ers in Colorado. And one of the guys that would really mentor me and go with me in this, his name was Jim, and he had hiked all the 14ers in Colorado, and he was great at leading me well and teaching me how to climb mountains. And he would tell me little things to bring, things not to bring, what to wear, what not to wear. He would tell me these little things that I thought were kind of quirky. He'd say, hey, always bring extra pair of socks. Well, why? Well, if you get wet, if they get wet, whether it's raining or you step in a stream or something like that, you do not want to be hiking in wet socks because it's going to rub blisters. He would tell me little quirky things like bring some peppermints or some gum because later in the hike, you're going to want something refreshing. It's going to give you a shot of energy. And I'm thinking, how can some spearmint gum or a peppermint give me a shot of energy? But pretty sure enough, it did. He would tell me things like to bring a bandana. And I would say, why do I need a bandana? And he would say, because later on in the hike, you want to dip it in a stream of water and put it over your neck and it's going to be so refreshing. And guess what? It was. So he was someone that led me well. He taught me what to look for, what not to look for. He taught me how to hike mountains, what to look for in the weather, how to tell if it was going to rain, when to get started, all of these types of things, even to the point where I was able to lead a group of people on my own without him to hike a 14,000 foot mountain. So he loved me and he led me well. And we've all had people like that. You know, maybe it's a teacher who really loved you and led you well, and you remember that teacher giving you some sound wisdom or helping you figure out how to solve something that you couldn't solve or teaching you a new skill. Maybe it's a boss who took you under their wing and said, hey, I love you. I want you to excel. I see something in you. So come and I'm going to teach you how to do this or how to do that, or I want to take you on to a conference so that you can learn something else. Maybe it was a mom and a dad who taught you how to do certain things at home, or how to play baseball, how to cook. They took care of you when you were sick. They handled and took care of you very, very well. There's all these people in our life that no matter what stage of life, we can look back on at least one or two and say, man, they loved me and they led me very, very well. Well, today, we're going to look at Jesus saying that he's the good shepherd and how he leads us well. And this is what he says in John 10, 11 through 15. He says, I'm the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. And then Jesus says this again in verse 14, I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. So the context is that this is a remarkable I am statement for Jesus, just like all of them have been. This is intimate. And it's intimate due to the fact that the metaphor of being a shepherd to his people shows a level of deep care and concern. Shepherds didn't merely lead the flock, they lived with the flock and cared for every intimate detail of the flock. And so one of the best descriptions of God as shepherd and of Jesus as shepherd actually comes from a shepherd himself, and that is David, King David. In Psalm 23, because before David became the king of Israel, he was a shepherd. And so if there was anybody who could give us good insight into what I am the good shepherd actually means, I think that it would be David. I think that David uses one of the best metaphors in Psalm 23 that really foreshadows who Jesus is, and I think foreshadows what Jesus says in John 10 when he says, I am the good shepherd. Now, the idea of Jesus and God being the shepherd is also the idea of us being sheep. And this is very countercultural. We live in a culture that wants us to take the lead. We live in a culture that wants us to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We live in a culture that wants us to be the center point, us to chart the course and call us to do those types of things. But in this metaphor, we're actually not the person that does that. We're actually the sheep. And we're actually the person that needs the care. We need the concern. We need that person, that shepherd, to lead us in our life and guide us in our life. And so the question is, what does that shepherd look like? Well, David, I believe, writes this about Jesus in Psalm 23. It's a foreshadowing of what Jesus says in John 10. When this is what David writes. And whether you've been in church for a long time or whether you haven't, I guarantee you've probably heard this psalm read, maybe at a funeral or some other event, but I bet you've heard this psalm read somewhere. And this is what he says. David writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside still waters, and he restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup, it actually overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me in the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." And so David paints us a picture of what a good shepherd does to his sheep. And so let's break this down a little bit, verse by verse, or a couple verses by couple verses. Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want." For David, the fact of God's shepherd-like care was the end of dissatisfied need. When David wrote, "I shall not want," it was both a declaration and a decision. I shall not want means all of my needs are supplied by the Lord, my shepherd. It's a declaration. It's saying to someone, guys, all my needs, everything that I ever need, God has provided. He has taken care of it for me. So it's declaring that about the Lord, but it's also deciding that about ourselves. I shall not want also means I decide to not desire more than the Lord, my shepherd, gives. Meaning it's also a decision of contentment. It's saying God's provided for all of my needs and I'm going to be content. I shall not want. I shall not try to strive for more than what God has given me because I'm thankful for it. Sarah and I have a saying, if it were good for us to have, God would give it to us, because not a good gift does our Lord withhold. And so it's this idea of understanding that if we have it, it's because we need it and he's supplied it. And if we don't have it, it's because, guess what? It wouldn't be good for us to have. It's just a way to live your life, declaring I shall not want and deciding I shall not want. I'm not going to want because every need's going to be taken care of. I'm not going to want because I'm going to be content and thankful for what I have. David continues and he says, he makes me lie down in green pastures and he leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. And I love this. I love to pray this saying, right? He leads me down paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Makes indicates that a sheep doesn't always know what it needs and what is best for itself. And so it needs help from the shepherd. Sometimes we think we know what we need and what we want. We think we know what's best for us. And sometimes God's like, wait a second, I'm seeing some things that you don't see. And so now I need to make you lie down in green pastures, even though you don't want to. Even though you want to keep going, I'm going to make you lie down. I'm going to make you rest. And so this idea of make indicates that sometimes God has to make us do some things that we don't want to do. The shepherd also knew the good place to make the sheep rest. He faithfully guides the sheep to green pastures. He doesn't guide the sheep into thorns and thistles. He doesn't guide the sheep onto rocky mountainsides. He guides the sheep into green pastures. He guides the sheep in a place that is peaceful and nice for them to lie down in. So the shepherd is a guide, right? The shepherd guides the sheep with an overarching view to the credit and glory of the shepherd, not the sheep. So when we lie down in green pastures, when we have our needs supplied, it's not to our credit, it's to the shepherd's credit. It's to the good shepherd's credit to say, it's because of the good shepherd that I'm lying down, and I'm lying down in green pastures. And he leads us down paths of righteousness for his name's sake, and that he deserves the glory, and he deserves the honor, and he deserves the praise. David continues, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. So when we read this, we know that he's talking about a valley. A valley suggests being hedged in and surrounded. There was one particular mountain group that we would go hike, and you would pull into kind of a valley, and you would get out and you would begin to walk on the trail. There were actually 4 14,000-foot mountains all around you. As you were walking through the valley, you could not see over them. You could not see around them. You were kind of hedged in. You were surrounded by these massive mountains. So the valley is sometimes the place where we feel like we're surrounded. There's no place out. We can't see beyond the mountaintop. We can't see beyond it. We don't know what's coming next, and we don't see any end in sight. When it says the valley of the shadow of death, means that what we face in this life oftentimes is just a shadow of what death gives us. It's not actually death itself. It casts a dark, fearful outline across our path of life. That a lot of times the things that we experience cast this ominous shadow, this ominous darkness on us, right? So it is in the valley of the shadow of death, facing what seems to David like ultimate defeat and evil, that God leads us through those things, right? He leads us, and even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So David recognized that under the shepherd's leading, he may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but that the valley is not going to be his dwelling place, and he's not going to be alone in it. This line is especially suggestive when we read the psalm with an eye toward Jesus in John 10:14, the good shepherd, and we understand that the shadow is not tangible, but it is just merely a shadow. In John 10:15, Jesus says that he lays down his life for his sheep. And so when we read Psalm 23, we see that Jesus is the fulfillment of Psalm 23. And I believe that Jesus is saying that I'm the one that David wrote about long time ago, and it foreshadowed in Psalm 23. And so when we look at this idea of the valley of the shadow of death, I think it's this. This is kind of like the whole crux of the passage. We can face the shadow of death because Jesus took the reality of death in our place. I think that's the reality of our life. That even though we're walking through these trials and tribulations, and some of them are greater than others and harder than others and more difficult to withstand than others, they leave their mark on us, right? But the point is that all of those things, the valley is just a shadow. It's not the reality of death, because Jesus took the reality of death on the cross. Why? Because he's a good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep. And so I think if you're an unbeliever or you're a believer, that's a really good news, right? It's good news that all the things that we face in this life, we have a shepherd that's going to navigate us through those things, but those are really not the realities of death. They're just merely a shadow. And that one day those two things will pass as well. And so then David continues in the midst of that, and he continues this kind of narrative of how this good shepherd navigates shadows and how the good shepherd navigates enemies that we face in our life. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. I think we might think that if he's a good shepherd, he would remove us from the presence of our enemies. But no, he prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies so that they can see the goodness of God on our life in the midst of all of that. He doesn't eliminate our enemies. He allows us to experience his goodness and faithfulness in their presence. Meaning that enemies don't have to be gone for you and I to experience the goodness of God. The enemies don't have to be gone for us to experience an amazing and have an amazing testimony of God's goodness and his faithfulness. And then, of course, his cup overflows. David's cup was overfilled. He flowed with joy because he experienced the richness of God's goodness. And so a full cup isn't when I'm only out of the valley. A full cup can be when I'm in the midst of a valley, because it's all about the goodness of God. And then he says this, he makes a declaration to end Psalm 23. He says, surely, meaning rest assured, absolutely going to happen. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David makes this declaration because of the good shepherd, goodness and mercy, they're going to follow me all the days of my life. And then he looks to eternity and says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Why? He's speaking from a place of experience. And so David ends the psalm with the calmest assurance that you and I and that he would enjoy the presence of the Lord forever. Why? Because we face a shadow of death, because Jesus took the reality of death in our place. It's remarkable that Jesus would call himself a shepherd. The reason it's so remarkable is because in Israel, as in other ancient societies, a shepherd's work was considered the lowest of all ranks. So can you imagine that the God of the universe coming down in human form in the person of Jesus would call himself a shepherd, the lowest of the ranks? If a family needed a shepherd, it was always the youngest. Just like David, when Samuel comes to anoint him as king and say, hey, God has chosen him as king, he's out in the field because he's the youngest of 14 brothers, and so he's deemed the shepherd. So God has chosen to be our shepherd, David says. The great God of the universe has stooped down to take such good care of me and you, and that's great news. We face a shadow of death because Jesus took the reality of death in our place, because he came from the highest of places at the right hand of the Father to earth and took on the lowliest of places, not only calling himself a shepherd, but also death on a cross, only so that he would be raised 3 days later and back to the right hand of the Father. So, Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd, which means that we face the shadow of death because Jesus took the reality of death in our place. God bless you.